Good evening and welcome. My name is Sean Ulmer. I'm Executive Director here at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. I want to thank you all for joining me for another in our monthly series called One Night Stand. This is where we look at one work by one artist for one evening and talk about it and provide some context for it. Tonight we're going to be looking at a work that's being drawn from our current large temporary exhibition, Work in Society in the 1930s, Paintings and Photographs from the Shogren-Meyer Collection. This is an exhibition that we have up over the summer, and it is a look at a private collection from Minneapolis, St. Paul, of 59 works that all sort of really focus on that incredible decade of the 1930s. A few works from the 20s, a few works from the 40s, but this is a passion for this husband and wife team of collectors, Dan Shogren and Susan Meyer. They are historians and political science majors by trade, or by training, I should say, but by trade, they're actually in the manufacturing industry. And over the course of time, realized that they really had this passion for art of the 1930s, and began to collect that work. And from that large collection of over 200 works, we have drawn 59 pieces, borrowed 59 pieces to be on view at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art this summer. So we are going to be looking at one of those works, Guy MacCoy's Resting, and I'm going to share my screen here to get my PowerPoint up. And I'm going to give it just a second here. Okay. The slideshow. There we go. All right. So Guy MacCoy's Resting from 1935, and this is the work in question here. It's a little bit unusual in the exhibition. It's unlike a lot of the other pieces in the exhibition. It's on a wall with other images of farming and farm workers, so it fits in that regard. But this is one of the more abstracted pieces, if you will, in the work, and that becomes apparent once we know a little bit more about Guy MacCoy. So here, what we see are two workers, farm workers, resting under the shade of a tree. You can see that there's these hay stacks in the background, rather pyramidal in form, and tiny little pyramids. I guess haystacks are in some ways the pyramids of the Midwest. You can see farm implements in the background, and you see the figures front and center. The shade that's cast by the tree is this really kind of interesting geometric block, and doesn't seem to be throwing shade on the figures themselves so much as outlining the space in which the shade actually is. And you can see the two figures here relaxing. One of the first things that people note when they look at this work is how large the hands are on both figures, but in particular on the figure on the left. And it is thought that it is MacCoy's interest in showing that this is really working hands. So these are hands that move the machinery, that reap the crops. It really all comes down to the use of these hands, and so they are more heavily emphasized than you see in the rest of the composition. And so if you've not seen the work in person, I have taken some detailed shots that I wanted to just share with you, can give you a sense of really the totality of the work. So here is that figure in particular, and you can see the hands really are, in an image like this, really are quite clearly emphasized. But what is also emphasized are the shadows. And so you see, while there is a gradation of color in the forms that you see here, the shadows are further accentuated by either a series of parallel lines or a series of crosshatch lines that you see here. And this is something that one sees far more often in the graphic arts. One sees it in drawing a great deal. One sees it on printmaking. And as we learn more about MacCoy, that the reason for this will become apparent. But I wanted you to take note of it right now, so that you can see how he utilizes these lines to further accentuate the shadows on the figures. Or here you can see it as well. And then there's all these wonderful little kind of squiggly lines that sort of fill in along the edges of the canvas itself. It really is a wonderful work when you start looking closely at it, and all of the details that are in it. It's one of those paintings that rewards you the more you look at it. Here, a detail of the farm implements. And here, a little bit closer view of the tree. Again, a little bit of glare from the varnish layer. But look at the shadow on the left-hand side of the tree, how that's articulated with just this really interesting sort of pattern. Here, another view of it. So who was Guy MacCoy? And it's interesting because in the process of doing this particular research, I discovered that sometimes Guy MacCoy is capital M-A-C-C-O-Y, as you see here in the signature. And sometimes I've seen in the scholarship, it's capital M-A-C, then capital C-O-Y. But based on the signature, on his own signature, we are presenting him as MacCoy, which is the capital M and not the capital C. And it's even more interesting when you realize that he's kind of changed this name himself. He was actually born in Rock Creek, Kansas, in 1904 to Clifford MacKay. So he was actually born Guy MacCoy, to Clifford MacKay and Clara Angeline Young, who was the granddaughter of Brigham Young. Clifford MacKay, the father, changed the family name to MacCoy, but that's M-C-C-O-Y. And then later on, Guy MacCoy changed it to M-A-C-C-O-Y. So changing the family name seemed to be a popular thing in the family. From a very young age, he demonstrated a natural aptitude for art. And in 1924, he began to take courses at the Kansas City Art Institute. I will show you here a picture of him. During that time, he met Gino Pettit, who became his wife. And in the summers, MacCoy traveled to Colorado Springs to attend the Broadmoor Art Academy. In 1929, so just a short time later, he wins a Tiffany Art Foundation scholarship in New York, and both he and Gino moved to New York City. The next year, he won the Art Students League scholarship and started taking classes at the Art Students League in New York, alongside people such as Jackson Pollock and Rico Lebrun and Thomas Hart Benton and Vaclav Vidlotzel. In 1933, he leaves the Art Student League to begin work with the Works Progress Administration. And he primarily did murals. Some are more attributed to him than others. But here's an image of him working on one of those murals, or here, sort of the larger sort of pull-out vision of that. And in 1934, New York Mayor LaGuardia instituted a large poster project, which MacCoy became deeply involved with, because MacCoy had been developing a series of ideas for a printing process utilizing a silk screen and experimenting with various components and mediums to produce the desired results. This is what was become the beginning of what would be known as the standard for reproducing original artwork, which became itself an art form. As such, MacCoy was becoming the father of the serograph. The serograph is a more technical term for silkscreen. And here is a photograph by MacCoy of Robert Rauschenberg pulling a silkscreen or using a squeegee across a silkscreen. And so MacCoy was actually very instrumental in the creation of the silkscreen process. And that is what actually he is best known for. And in 1938, he has his first one-person show of newly named serigraphs at the Contemporary Art Gallery. And I inserted this shot. This is not by MacCoy or of MacCoy. This is of Andy Warhol, who was to take the silkscreen process to new heights. But it all begins with Guy MacCoy, whom we see here much further along in his career, working as a silkscreen artist. In 1940, he graduates from Columbia University with a Bachelor's of Arts in Teaching, and he and Gino moved first to Vermont, where he took up work with the Polographic Lithographic Company as a color separator and dot etcher on the zinc lithographic plates. In 1945, he and Gino leave Vermont for Los Angeles, California. And a few years later, MacCoy begins teaching at the newly formed Jepson Art Institute in Los Angeles. And this is where his screen printing processes really take off. In 1948, he forms the Western Serigraph Society and becomes its first president. And in 1949, the Otis Art Institute of Los Angeles' director Millard Sheets convinced MacCoy to join the Otis Art Institute faculty, where he remained for the next 11 years and retired in 1960 at the age of 65. In 1961, he continued to teach art, but at a variety of locations, including UCLA and the Palos Verdes Art Center. In 1965, he was asked to join the newly formed Los Angeles Print Society. And in 1970, a devastating fire swept up the Santa Susana Mountains and destroyed his home and studio, his and Gino's home and studio, along with all of their possessions and art and memorabilia. That was actually 2 weeks after he had been notified by their fire insurance company that their policy had been canceled because they were in a high fire location. So they had no insurance to recoup all of their losses. However, word of their demise came out, and there was a huge outpouring of support of all types, from students, fellow artists, and other associates. They were able to establish the first of 2 new Guy MacCoy studios in Canoga Park near his new residence. And in 1972, he opened up a second, larger, and greatly updated Guy MacCoy studio, where he began printing again his own serigraphs and teaching art classes. Finally, in 1981, MacCoy, having gone into the advanced stages of ALS, commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease, passed away after 8 months in the hospital. His wife Gino passed a year later. So that's the biography of MacCoy. But I'd like to always sort of share not only images of the artist here, MacCoy working in the silkscreens process, the serigraph process, but also sort of look more wholly at their career to provide visual context for the work that we have on view for resting. So first going to look at some paintings, and this is a painting that dates from 2 years before resting. And so you can see there's the same sense of color, same sense of color palette, same sense of simplification of form. It's perhaps a little less abstracted than resting is, but you can see that there is a great simplification of shadowing. You don't have that same line shadowing that one sees in resting, but you see more sort of the painted shadow here But again, it is a simplified composition, similar in form to what we see in Resting from 2 years later. And this is from quite a bit later than that. This is from another 20 years after the piece that you just saw, give you a sense of how MacCoy's style continues to evolve. You see here, there is an interest in flatness, and flatness of form. You still get a sense of space in all of these compositions in Resting, and in the previous image and in this image, largely either through stacking or through overlapping. So you get a real good sense of space here, but it is very much a simplified composition. It is abstracted, it is flatter, with these sort of blocked out areas and blocks of color. And here, even later, from what I've been able to sort of surmise, where he's gone much more abstract, and a little bit less geometric in his approach. Here, sort of much later, a very flat and abstracted and geometric piece. So this is where he goes basically in his paintings. But it is his print work for which he is best known. And here I wanted to show the only lithograph I was able to find by MacCoy. And as I mentioned in his biography, while he was still a painter, he did spend some time doing some lithographic work early in his career. And here's sort of a typical sort of lithograph for him. I wanted to kind of include it, but it was really in the silkscreen process that he excelled. And this is one of his earliest screen prints, or serigraphs. This dates from 1932. It's in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and it is one of the first two that are oftentimes cited when people write about MacCoy. And you can see here many interesting comparisons to Resting, to the painting Resting, and that sense of line, and using that line to articulate texture, to articulate shadow, that is clearly evident in this serigraph as well as in our painting. And he takes that sense of pattern a little further in a work like this from 1941, which is after the date of Resting, which is 1935. But you can see that there is this, great sense of pattern in the background and along the front edge there, and that really sort of helps to define different planes in the composition, and to help communicate again this rather simplified form, in this case purple flowers and other still life elements. Simplified form, again, sort of seen from a little bit of a raised vantage point, tilted table plane on which these items are resting. But again, you do still get a wonderful sense of depth, of space in the composition, but through a more abstracted manner. Here, not so abstract, interestingly, is a 1942 serigraph, and you still get sort of a simplified sense of shadow in the composition, but it is much less abstracted overall than say Purple Flowers. And I was able to find a number of details of a composition like this, which I think is really quite wonderful, and it gives you a little bit better sense of the screen printing process, and what you're able to accomplish. One of the biggest challenges with the screen printing process, of course, was finding the right inks that would pass through the screen and do what you wanted them to do as an artist. And that was one of the bigger challenges that slowed down the entire process for MacCoy, was finding the right inks. Here, a different composition but from a little bit later. I did try to arrange all of these in chronological fashion. But again, you can see how with the silk screen process, how he's able to separate and separate these colors and lay them one on top of the other, and give you that same sense of depth and space. I'm here from 1945, something a little bit more akin to the Purple Flowers image that you see. Again, he did quite a few still lifes. Still lifes tended to be something that recurred frequently throughout his career, and many of these prints are still quite obtainable. And if you're interested in a lot more information on MacCoy, there is a website and a Facebook page dedicated to him. So there is more information that you can get out, and lots more images. If you're interested to see even more images that are more from later in his career. You see here from fewer years later, again, this great sense of depth by overlap in this composition. Really quite remarkable printmaker. Another still life. Again, kind of this sort of stacking and layering one on top of the other. Another still life, melon and apples. Again, it seems to be a recurring theme in his career, but no two are the same. You do have the same sort of tilted table plane in this composition, but yeah, different elements. He's maybe revisiting a theme. He's not repeating a composition. And then a little bit later becomes even a bit more abstracted. There is this, again, this same sense of overlap and layering in his compositions. And here from 1960, I think this is sort of near the last of the images that I had to share with you. This one less abstracted in a way. So he has not completely abandoned representational work. This is somewhat abstracted, but not as abstracted as some of the ones that we have been looking at. But it's a really remarkable, a wonderful image, and I thought a great image to kind of end on. And I think I have one more with just a signature at the bottom again. How he wrote his name, which is the model that we are following. So, but I just wanted to use this opportunity to share with you a few other images, not just of MacCoy's painting, but also of his print work, which is what he became particularly well known for. And it really sort of explains the way he used those parallel lines and cross-hatching lines in the painting, because he was already deep mentally into printmaking, even though he was just beginning to perfect his, serigraph technique, which really sort of opened up the door for so many subsequent artists. But it's very much the way in which he was conceiving of articulating, further underscoring the shadows in his composition. And you see those clearly, perhaps more clearly, in his printed work, but he is utilizing it in a painted composition, like Resting. And again, it is really kind of a standout composition in the exhibition Work and Society in the 1930s. And well worth a look-see in person. I thank you for joining me. Please join us again next month for another in this series, and our new curator, Julia Jessen, will be taking that one on. It'll be a wonderful opportunity amongst many opportunities that I hope for you to meet either in person or visually, in person or virtually, excuse me, our new curator, whom we're so very happy to have join us. She's been here a full week in 2 days now, and has already hit the ground running. So please seek out an opportunity to meet her in person. If not that, then do plan to join her next month for our next one night stand. Thank you again for your time this evening, and and look forward to seeing you next time.